Aloha everyone, it's Anjanette and I am here to do your lecture on the developmental and feminist theories of personality. This is some of my favorite theories actually. I am a developmentalist by training and a feminist by choice, and so both of these theoretical perspectives really resonate with me. They're going to expand your understanding and knowledge of the personality theories and how we become who we are, so that you can compare and contrast the theories that we've learned throughout the semester and see which one best explains your personality, or which ones might be useful in analyzing personalities or in understanding what shapes people, and the complexity thereof, right? Okay, so let's dive in. This week we're going to do actually two chapter readings, the developmental reading for chapter 7 in Kellen's book and the feminist theories reading, also from Kellen's book. And we're going to start with some developmental theories. So first, let me talk to you a little bit about what developmental psychology is. When we talk about developmental psychology, we're talking about studying how people change over their lifespan. Although this image shows from infancy through late adulthood, we actually cover prenatal, from womb all the way to death and dying, to tomb. So developmental psychology studies three different domains: how people change physically, cognitively, and then social and emotionally. So we look at how our brain develops and changes, how our bodies change, our different capacities throughout different stages of life. We also look at cognitively how our ability to think, reason, understand the world, and our language and intelligence changes throughout our lifespan. And memory also falls into cognitive. And then we look at socially and emotionally. How does our sense of self change throughout our life? And as well as how do our relationships change throughout our life? So some of those things that we've already studied in terms of self-esteem, self-concept, self-efficacy, even just our sense of self, our self-concept, that changes throughout life. And developmental psychology looks at how it might emerge and how it might unfold into a really strong identity and personality later on in life. Erik Erikson is probably the foremost theorist in developmental psychology. He is a psychoanalytic by training, so he did study with Freud, and he actually was very beloved, but then Anna Freud kind of felt like he had kind of abandoned the principles of psychoanalysis when he presented his own theory, which was a spin on psychoanalytic. But Erik Erikson was also raised in Germany, and he didn't know his dad. Erikson's not his name. He actually adopted that name later on in life because he was adopted by his stepfather, Theodore, and Hamburger was a name that brought about, a lot of childhood trauma. We make fun of each other based on names. And that's really sad because we don't have any choice or say in our name, obviously. So Erik Erikson said, I do have a choice. And after his first child was born, he adopted Erikson. And so, as I indicated, he actually studied psychoanalysis informally, actually, not into a formal through a formal education, but because he was considered one of the foremost psychoanalysts based on his studying with Freud and working directly with Freud, it earned him some accolades and some credibility, and he was appointed to Harvard Medical School as a psychoanalyst, and that opened up doors and opportunities for him. And he was a very prolific writer and publisher that also really established his expertise in the field for which he was informally trained. Um, I shouldn't say it was informally. When you're being mentored and there's like an apprenticeship type structure, and I don't really consider that to be informal, but it certainly is outside the structure of a formal college education. So there's a few kind of underlying values and themes that informed Erikson's theory, and one of them includes this idea of epigenetics. So we often study and understand genetic influences where we look at how our DNA might be related to our personality and other aspects of our psychological functioning, how certain genes are tied to certain traits, IQ and other things. And epigenetics really looks at kind of how our genetics are modified to our environment, or from our environment. And so, as it relates to Erikson's theory, this principle was really looking at the influence of our environment, of our experiences, of those dynamic psychological and social interactions that truly start to shape us as individuals. And so he suggested that we develop in a set of stages, much like Freud. However, where he differs is those stages extend throughout the lifespan. So unlike Freud, Erikson believed that yes, our childhood experiences are important, and we do go through predictable stages throughout childhood, but he also believed that we continue to experience changes really well into adulthood and throughout life. And later on, his wife even predicted or proposed a stage beyond Erikson's 8 stages of what he called psychosocial development. So the driving force in this genesis of our personality is psychosocial crises, whereas Freud centered it around a sexual crisis or a sexual physical urge that needed to be met, the oral, the anal, the phallic, latent, and genital stages. Erikson suggested it's actually a social crisis that we experience, and that impacts our psychological development throughout our lifespan. He suggested it's not dreams that are the royal road to understanding children or the royal road to understanding people or the unconscious. Rather, it's play. Watching children at play gives you insight into their sense of self, into their ego, into their identity. And play is also a wonderful resource and tool. It acts as a mechanism by which relationships are built, by which they develop an understanding of the world and the roles they have in them. It also is a mechanism to recreate scenarios and use that to either gain some insight and understanding into how that's impacting a child, and or as a source of therapy and healing for the child, particularly when you're trying to help them overcome trauma. Erikson also really emphasized the importance of culture and looking at cross-cultural studies. How does development exist not just in a Eurocentric perspective and in European cultures, but rather can those same developmental stages and psychosocial crises be observed in indigenous cultures, in Native American cultures, in the various diverse cultures even within a European or American culture, such as Black culture? Do we see that the way in which our Black Americans experience life and engage in society is different? And how might that influence their development? How might those social interactions shape who they are in their various identities? And do they face unique struggles and challenges? And what he did find is that his theory is universally observed throughout cultures, but there are individual variations in terms of the challenges and experiences that different ethnic groups experience, based on bias, hate, and disparities in privilege and power. And so here are the 8 psychosocial stages. So I want you to take note that this is the kind of age range, right? When we name the stages, we typically name them as trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt. We really don't name them infancy or early child. That's just the developmental period that they're in. We really talk about them in terms of the psychosocial crisis, much like Freud did, where he talked about the oral stage or the anal stage, right? We talk about Erikson's stages, trust versus mistrust. And so there's a virtue that emerges from this psychosocial conflict, depending upon their nurturing. And remember that balance that was necessary in Freud's theory? That same, not balance, but experience with the parenting, with the mothering, with those social interactions. And you'll see that it's initially focused on the parent or the primary caretaker, but then it shifts to other relationships throughout our lives. So how we engage in those initial parenting and caretaking relationship influences how we resolve these crises. Ideally, we're resolving them in a healthy, empowering way, and that allows us to achieve these virtues or these values that end up kind of carrying us, and they're reflected in our personality, in our identities, and in our functioning in relationships throughout life. So let's look at these conflicts. In infancy, remember, we're in a complete state of dependence on our caretaker. So how well and responsive our caretaking or how is really kind of indicates or shapes, influences our outcome. When we cry, when we have a need, do we have a caretaker that's nurturing, that's loving, that's sensitive, that's responsive, that tries to assess our needs in a timely manner and meet those needs? Are we hungry? Are we tired? Do we need social interaction? Do we need change? And if they are, in fact, supportive, responsive, nurturing, it can foster a sense of trust, right? And that sense of trust is internalized, and it becomes a foundation for kind of how we see the world. So we're gaining not just a sense of trust in that relationship, but that's now empowering us to gain a sense of trust in future relationships as well. Now, if by chance we don't have responsive caretaking, then we might actually develop mistrust, skepticism, fear, anxiety, and we don't have that hope that the world is a safe place, right? Because we're in a state of uncertainty, maybe even neglect. And so that early caretaking in that first year of life is really fundamental to giving us effectively a sense of security. Then we move into what is our toddlerhood stage, what Erikson called autonomy versus shame and doubt. Now, this does tie to that sense of self that emerges that Freud referenced, right? Where we're actually gaining awareness of our own bodies, we're gaining a sense of control over our own bodily functions, and we start to identify that we are separate, empowered human beings. So not just potty training happens right now, but this true self-awareness emerges during this time of life. And that's why you start to hear toddlers say no, because they are gaining an awareness of themselves as separate, empowered, autonomous, distinct human beings. And so they develop that will, that independence, and they say no to assert their self and their will. And in a loving, nurturing, responsive environment, they can develop that sense of autonomy. Or if they're in an unhealthy environment, they might develop shame. They might develop doubt in their sense of self and their will and their sense of power. So it goes back to the caretaking, not in a sexual way, but in a social way. Are they being encouraged and empowered to gain that autonomy? Is that environment fostering autonomy for them? Are they being supported and encouraged and cheered on for their really strong and delightful sense of self? Then we move into early childhood, and this is the preschool years, where now it moves from autonomy to now initiative. Now I not only know who I am, and I'm gaining a sense of will and independence, but now I can also gain a sense of purpose. I want to actually initiate, not just decline or accept opportunities or options, but now I'm going to decide what I want to do, how I want to dress, what I want to eat, and I'm going to try to make it for myself. And so this is an age where they want to dress themselves. You might hear things like, I'm a big boy, I'm a big girl, right? And they want to take that initiative. They want to do things for themselves. I'll never forget my little girl, and she wanted to dress herself. So how can I foster that initiative? How can I really encourage her in that independence? So I would put her clothes together. Instead of having a drawer of shirts and a drawer of pants, I'd put outfits together so she could get up in the morning and dress herself. Sometimes she still picked outfits that didn't match, but I would cheer her along, and we'd go to school with, mismatched clothes, and her teachers would, wow, Michaela, you dressed yourself today. And she would be so proud, like her little peacock feathers were up, and her teachers would cheer her on, and that helped to just water that sense of initiative, to give her that sense of purpose and pride that was so important to building her confidence and instilling that in her personality over the long term. Now, in an unhealthy environment, we might actually guilt them. And so shame and guilt are two different things, where shame is more directed at self, and guilt can be directed at others, because cognitively they understand not just their own independence and their own will, but they understand others' expectations now. And there's a pressure and a sense of, am I disappointing you? And I can feel guilty for that if I've disappointed you. So at this stage, they're not only focused on their own understanding of themselves, but now your understanding of them as well. And so you can, in fact, in those early childhood years and those preschool years, you can really start to build a sense of self-consciousness if you're not fostering that initiative in a healthy way, and let them initiate activities. Encourage them for trying when they're unsuccessful. Compliment their efforts. Compliment the character traits that you want them to continue to develop and cultivate. Try not to compliment things like they're so smart or they're so pretty, because those might feel like they're things that are outside of their control. But when you say, oh, you're so kind, you're so considerate, I love how helpful you are, look at how how well you organized your drawer, or oh, those were really good choices, or thank you for sharing. You're always so generous and kind. So complimenting them on their behaviors can really also foster that sense of initiative and empowerment that we want to instill, and that purpose we want to instill in their personalities. Moving on to elementary school and school-age children, now the focus is competence. Industriousness is, remember those lists that you used to walk into your classroom and there was a list on the board. You got to do these reading sheets and write your spelling words 5 times, and pages 10 through 12 for your math book, that kind of stuff. Well, we would check the box, right? Put a check mark when you're done, or cross it off the list, and that felt good, right? That's industriousness. When we're able to cross stuff off of our list, we're really productive. We get stuff done. We're developing skills and competencies, math skills, reading skills, language skills, knowledge of history, science, those types of things. Even our PE and developing soccer skills and basketball skills. All of that can contribute to a sense of industriousness. It can foster competencies, empowerment, confidence, self-esteem, particularly if we're strong in areas that we value either individually or within our families. There's a lot of pressure maybe in your family to be a good athlete, but you kind of have 2 left feet. That might actually foster inferiority, where we feel like we lack competence, we're not good enough, we don't have the skills necessary to be successful in areas that are valued. Then that can undermine our sense of confidence and undermine our industriousness. And sadly, this is a time when, cognitively, children are also really comparing, organizing, sequencing. We call it seriation, and classification. And they know where they stand with their relative to their classmates. They know whether they're a good reader, a good speller, a good mathematician. And sadly, you might have teachers that bring about shame. I know I teach stats, and so I deal with a lot of math trauma where students are anxious about math. They doubt their skills and competency, not always because they don't have the skills, but because they haven't been taught yet in a way that can foster those strengths, right? And so it really is important to be self-reflective, and to try to be an advocate for healthier, more empowering elementary school practices and structures that foster industriousness and stop comparing us to one another, and instead look at that individual growth. How has my math skill grown from where I started to where I am now, versus how do I compare, to Maria and Susie and Jose and Tyrone, right? Like, how do I compare to other people? How do I compare to Leilani? And I don't want to focus on that. I want to look at, how do I compare to Aj, right? How has Aj grown and changed from the beginning until now? What am I doing better? Where have I grown? Where are my opportunities for growth? So that approach can definitely foster industriousness and competence. Then moving on, which is probably one of the most critical stages of Erikson's theory, and that's identity versus role confusion. And our identity is really a central part of our personality, right? temperament and identity really combine to shape our personality from a developmental perspective. And that identity is, who am I in terms of my gender, my sexuality, my cultural identity matters. Um, maybe the activities, like how do I see myself as a soccer player or as a volleyball player, but also uh, how do I see myself in terms of my political views, my religious identity, my career identity, and what I want to aspire to. And there's a lot of pressure on our teens, to decide what they want to do for the rest of their lives as early as junior high and high school. And there's a lot of that career pressure. So we do have to be careful about that, right? We have to give them opportunities to explore, to identify, to discover, to build that identity. But we want to be careful that we're not pressuring them too much, that we're kind of forcing them into an artificial confusion where they just don't know, they can't figure out what they want to do, and they honestly shouldn't have to. Their frontal lobes aren't even fully developed. That's one of the things I love about community college. It gives you a space for exploration. So you can continue to explore your identity. You can take different classes. You can ignite new passions and interests. You can find your voice and discover what drives you and motivates you and who you are. And so Erickson called that a moratorium, an identity moratorium. It's a period of exploration. It's a period of figuring it out and trying and experimenting and seeing what you like, and new identities might emerge and shape. And honestly, although he focused on moratorium in adolescence, I really believe that major life experiences throw us back into moratoriums throughout life. And maybe it's a marriage, maybe it's a divorce, maybe it's the loss of a loved one, maybe it's a trauma or an accident that you incurred. Those types of things can actually inspire a moratorium where you begin to search for your identity again. You begin to kind of redefine who you are and your new values, new focus, new commitments. So although moratorium in Erickson's theory is prominently a task that happens in adolescence, it can continue throughout life. Now, in early adulthood, we are shifting. So I want you to notice the shift here in these first 3 stages. It's often our parents, our caretakers. If we have the opportunity to go to preschool, definitely our preschool environment can start to shape us. When we become school age in that middle childhood, our classroom environment has a huge influence and social role in shaping our identity and our personality, these virtues that might emerge. Now in adolescence, that school focus and that peer focus continues to be of significant importance. Moving into early adulthood, guess what? Now our partners, our intimate relationships, our closest friends really start to have a huge influence on us. Remember, this is about the time people might get married, they might settle down, and their focus shifts, right? And now they have this individual that they're spending their life with and sharing their household with and sharing their dreams and goals with. And so love becomes that focal point at this stage of life. It becomes the virtue, and how they function in relationships can give them a sense of intimacy. Intimacy is not sexual. It's a sense of closeness. It's an emotional intimacy, right? How do they connect with others? We are social beings, and so those connections with others matter. They shape who we are. They shape our personality. And I know some people who are more isolated. My son is one. He doesn't have a very strong network. He doesn't have a large network by any means. You don't need a lot of friends, but you do need intimate attachments and closeness with a handful of people throughout your life. You need a support system. You need to feel loved, and you need to be able to love others and share yourself and reach out to others. So that's where this emerges now, is in that early adulthood. In middle adulthood, we now shift from intimacy and isolation to generativity versus stagnation. Now, notice this covers a wide area, right? And we don't talk about it as old age. We actually break up late adulthood into old, old, and very old, right? So this actually has 3 stages within itself. But now we've had kids, maybe we are entering into grandparenthood. All of that now causes us to focus not just on ourselves, but also on the next generation, that generativity. I want to make the world a better place for my children and my grandchildren. It's not just about my success now. It's about how can I care for others? How can I care for the world? How can I leave the world in a better place than what I found it? How can I be a wonderful contributing member of society? Do I feel part of something bigger than just myself? And that can come through family, that can come through church, that can come through causes that you might be involved with. You might see that in middle adulthood, people get involved in philanthropy, in community service. They might want to give back, or they may even want to pursue careers in fields that were valuable for them and helped them. And so the virtue here is care, caring for others in the world around us. And if you don't have that opportunity to foster that, then you might develop a sense of stagnation where you're just kind of stuck. You're stuck in a rut. Maybe you feel like your life doesn't have purpose or meaning. You were never able to pursue the things that were of interest to you and figure out what those things are. And that stagnation can be an uncomfortable place. Now, you might hear people talk about a midlife crisis, which is largely mythical. But sometimes when like for me, I had children at a young age. You know, I never really had the opportunity to think about college when I was younger, and so it was something I started in adulthood. And in middle age, I kind of redefined myself and went into teaching, changed my careers. And so you can do that throughout life. Your identity, your personality continues to evolve throughout life. And that's a central component of Erikson's theory that makes him very different from a lot of the other developmental theories or just theorists in general. And then finally, that last stage from Erikson is integrity versus despair. In all these other stages, we're kind of looking forward, right? This one, we look back. The focus is on wisdom, right? We're kind of assessing our lives, and is it a life well done? Did we leave behind a bunch of regrets, or are we leaving behind accomplishments, achievements? Have we contributed in a meaningful way? And so, if so, we feel a sense of integrity. We feel, like we have wisdom and value to pass on to others. But if we have a life of regrets, we might find ourselves in a place of despair. We might find ourselves isolating more and maybe even carrying some shame into those final years of life. So notice the connection and how this identity connects to personality. Again, it continues to evolve throughout life. So Joan Erickson was actually Erik Erikson's wife, and she presented, as I mentioned, a ninth stage, and that is despair versus gerotranscendence. So when you look at, remember, we break up, as developmentalists, we break up late adulthood into old, very, or old, and then very old. And in the later stage of life, as we start to kind of return to a place of dependence where our bodies are declining, we need support, maybe walking or with our transferring, or even maybe with our vital, like cooking and eating and even bathing and toileting. Our bodies are declining and we need support. We also may find that our spouse passes away. We might find a lot of friends and family are passing away. I feel like I'm, very young, but experiencing this already. It inspires a different reflection in life, right? It inspires kind of a period where you doubt your own ability. Your independence is being thrown into question again. You might feel like, what meaning or value or purpose do I have now? And we might find ourselves struggling more to understand who we are and what value we bring. And in that case, we might isolate ourselves. And that just is like a further exasperation of the despair that Erickson talked about, but it becomes more debilitating in Joan's ninth stage. Or we can transcend those things. And maybe some of you have grandparents and great grandparents, and they're out there at 90 years old still kicking ass. They might still be gardening and baking and serving the community and fully independent. And I just heard my uncle was sharing about his auntie, driving, cruising around at 90 years old. And those types of things you're transcending the limitations of your body. You're transcending the limitations of society's expectations of you. And you're still living a full, rich, empowered life. And what a joy that would be if we could all experience that, right? So, focusing on ego identity as a central component of Erickson's theme, and understanding how, yes, we have our own temperament. Anyone who's had children knows that even in the womb, every baby kind of has their own temperament, right? Some are more active than others. Some are night owls. Some respond to different types of music, different energy, right? So that is really in something within us, not just at birth, but at conception, right? And it continues to evolve. But when we start to gain that sense of self, and when we have that social support and those social networks, then it can really now help us cultivate these virtues and these personality traits, and it can encourage and empower and shape us in fundamental ways. Some of us are given opportunity to explore our identities, and in some societies and cultures, there isn't that opportunity. We're kind of thrown into adulthood. We're thrown into very kind of structured expectations and rules, and we don't have the opportunity to explore identity. So certainly this identity exploration is a privilege, and it has a tremendous role in shaping our personality. But it most definitely is influenced by our culture and our cultural values. I think I'm not sure if I've shared, but so I'm Native Hawaiian, and I had a couple of aunties who were Hanai'd, and three of them who were Hanai'd and raised on the islands. And then my grandmother moved to the continent with my grandfather. She was the first in our family to leave the islands, and she had 9 children off island, and those children are very different than the children raised in Hawaii. Their personalities are very, very different, because when you're immersed in Hawaiian culture, and it's a very collectivist culture, aloha is a central value, right? A connection to the Aina and a sense of care and responsibility to the Aina and to the people is really important. Community is really important. And on the continent, independence is valued and fostered at a young age. And so my aunties raised on the islands are very different than my aunties raised on the continent. And there's good and bad in both, right? And thankfully, even no matter where you're at, Aina or not, those cultural values can still be instilled in us, and we can still cherish those. So I have a strong sense of family connection, even from my mother, who was raised on the continent. So that being said, those cultural values really shape our identities in fundamental ways, and ultimately our personalities. So some of the challenges that we might face as we're trying to cultivate an identity, and as our personalities are emerging and being shaped throughout our lifespan, is the ratio. What percentage of these stages did we resolve in a healthy way, where on the left side, you see the positive, right? Trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, identity, intimacy, generativity, integrity. What percentage of these stages did we resolve that conflict on the healthy side? And what percentage did we resolve on the unhealthy? Mistrust, shame and doubt, guilt, inferiority, confusion. And with Joan's stage, notice she flipped it and she put the negative first and the positive second. And she did that intentionally, right? Because particularly in a Eurocentric culture, despair might be more common in late adulthood, where in American culture, where they ended up moving and living out their lives. In American culture, we don't always value our elderly in the same way that you might see on the islands or in other indigenous cultures. And so despair might be the more common resolution, sadly, and it doesn't need to be. So that ratio really matters. That ratio of what percentage did we resolve in a healthy way? And how did that contribute to our identities? We could potentially develop a negative identity, where we actually reject society's expectations, we reject our family's expectations, and or we feel like we've lost our identities, potentially as a result of trauma, right? Or where we never felt a sense of connection or support. We never had that social, because remember, this is the psychosocial theory of development. We never had that social support and resource to develop that identity. So we might use an alternative means of finding community and connection through gangs, and other unhealthy groups. And then also, when you think about our marginalized populations, including women, including various ethnic groups throughout society, particularly in westernized cultures, they face bias, They face prejudice, discrimination, and our Mahu and LGBTQ communities um, have even, faced genocide. Various groups, cultural genocide. Our own Hawaiian people, right, have faced cultural genocide. And consequently, that might shape our identity. We can internalize that bias. We can internalize that hate and that prejudice. And in many ways, the Native Hawaiian people have internalized that very colonial mindset, and it can negatively impact our identity. It can, make us question the value of our culture. It can make us, uh, you know, it can undermine our sense of self-esteem, our confidence, our sense of cultural pride, and that's intentional, right? That's intentional. That helps to um, minimize resistance is when they strip you of your cultural identity, which is why they outlaw languages, which is why they restrict the practicing of your cultural traditions. And additionally, when we shame, or there's social hierarchies, which is a natural part of social identity, right? And in westernized societies, there's a very patriarchal, misogynistic, and sexist hierarchy, where we know that certain groups have more power on the gender hierarchy. Cisgender men have more power. So women, you even, think about the way that feminine attributes are shamed. You fight like a girl, right? Or, calling someone, a bitch, like that's supposed to mean, oh, you're a wimp, or you're mine. Um, the way, violence against women, and the way that women have been objectified, and men were allowed to beat their wives, and rape their wives, and there were no legal consequences. And we had come a long way, but um, sadly, we're going backwards. And so we need to continue to advocate. And then also, when you talk about like our Black Americans who were stolen from their from their homelands, and brought to the continent, and enslaved, that separates them from their cultural heritage and opportunity to develop their identity. Or, we see the same for people throughout the Pacific, through blackbirding, where they were stolen from their various islands, and taken to westernized societies, and separated from their families. All of those things might influence the development of negative identities, and ultimately that could shape our personalities in negative ways as well. So identity, is, family is often kind of a tool and a resource to help pass particularly your cultural identity and your family identities, right? The way in which we're socialized is primarily through our parents, our family, and then the social systems, school, the justice system, the religious institutions, all of those health systems, all of those major social systems become larger macro socializing agencies. But it starts in the home with the family. First, our family of origin, or our nuclear family. They're not all nuclear, right? The idea of nuclear family is a fairly new concept that emerged in the 1950s, but we've always had mixed, blended families, particularly with life expectancies being very different. More risks, war, disease took the lives of people early. So blended families have really been the norm throughout American history and throughout much of world history, even in Hawaiian history, right? It's not uncommon that there's half siblings, and this husband and that husband and multiple wives. And so this idea of a nuclear family is different. So I'm going to talk about our family of origin, where we were born into. And then we talk about a family of procreation, which is a family that we create with our partners through the connections, relationships we form, and the children we have together, either through adoption or birth. And then there's often also family of choice, right? And we may choose friends to be our family members as well. And so that family becomes a central element of our identity. And many of you might identify as a mother, and we'll talk about that in feminist theory, or as a father, or as a sister or daughter. Those identities might be really central to who you are. And throughout adulthood, those identities will change based on those roles. You will start to see yourself shifting in your priority, your values, your perspective, your interests. My even as a mom, my kids, I have, a first litter of older children and a second litter. My kids are like, wow, Mom, you've changed so much. And I have. I'm not the same person. Throughout life, we kind of see our sense of self emerge in those toddlerhood years, and it can become more empowered throughout life and throughout adulthood. Our self-esteem can rise, but then it starts to decline in late adulthood. So what we see is, your self-esteem can grow in early childhood, depending upon what your experiences are. Your self-esteem can take a dive in adolescence with puberty, and then it can start to grow and incline throughout early adulthood, middle adulthood, and then in late adulthood we see a bit of a decline. So all of these sense of self and who we are and self-empowerment, they change, they evolve. It's not static at all. And in late adulthood, particularly as people are, dealing with a lot of death and reflecting on their own lives, they really might become very religious. They might take comfort in faith. They might, dive deep back into their cultural roots, and, be a huge part of continuing on those cultural traditions, and particularly in indigenous populations or Aboriginal populations, where our elderly are so critical to holding on to that culture and educating the next generations in the ceremonies, the practices, the traditions. But how we treat them in society as a whole, how we value them, what activities we offer access to, and empowerment and encouragement, and what don't, what resources do we make available, how they engage with changing technology, are they embracing it, are they resisting it, are they thriving or not. And then, of course, looking at their health and functioning, and how that body image might change and evolve, particularly for women in a society where beauty is prized and youth is prized, and vitality is prized. It might change their sense of identity. They might have new things to grapple with, and that might impact their personality as well. And then just kind of reflecting a little bit on a Western lens, where elderly sometimes are avoided altogether. It can contribute to a sense of isolation. We don't value them as much. We sometimes don't even engage them in conversations, maybe because it's harder to have a conversation. They might struggle to hear, or sometimes we start to talk down to them like toddlers, and we start to treat them differently. They're not always revered in Western cultures. They may even be feared. You might be afraid of them as their looks change. And unfortunately, that has an impact on them. It has an impact on their sense of identity and whether they feel like they can bring value, or whether there's going to be any joy from being engaged. And so they may choose to disengage as a result. But and they're also managing, a changing and often deteriorating body that might make them feel powerless. And they might be ashamed and embarrassed by that, and so they isolate, and that can cause a tremendous amount of despair and loneliness. Uh, Often what we find is when people retire, that can be a critical point where they might lose a sense of purpose and a huge part of their identity. And so, we have to make sure that they are connected in other ways. Um, so there are different views of age. Erickson said he was focused on that continuous search for identity and that continuous evolving identity throughout life, wanting that social acceptance and connection. And Carl Rogers, he continued to thrive well into his 80s, and so how those two kind of grew older differently and how they experienced a late adulthood gives us something to reflect on and consider. Some people, like I know my mother-in-law, man, she just thrives. Her and my mother are so opposite. My mom's in the despair, and my mother-in-law is definitely in the integrity. And she's thriving, and her grandchildren give her a sense of purpose. Her grandchildren bring her tremendous joy and value. She still likes to host family functions. She may not do all the cooking anymore, but she still does a lot of it. So, reach out to your grandparents today if you still have the privilege of having them in your life, and give them a little love and a little nod today. And then death and dying. Interestingly enough, as somebody that, was diagnosed with cancer and battled cancer, the prospect of death shapes your personality too. It influences your identity. Now part of my identity is I'm a cancer survivor. I'm a cancer patient, and that's pretty daunting. I got to be real. When death is on the horizon or potentially on the horizon, man, it changes. It changes you. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross presented a theory on death and dying, and she talked about dying isn't just something that happens, right? Like one single event. It's a process, and it begins the moment we believe death is imminent. Whether that's a diagnosis or whether that's just getting older and losing your functionality, and struggling in different areas and recognizing it's coming. Or maybe it's the loss of a loved one that makes you start to recognize we're at that age. It's starting to happen. And so that grieving process starts. She suggested we go through 5 stages. We often talk about this of grief, right? The stages of grief. She actually did her research on people who are diagnosed with a terminal illness and who are dying. So these are actually the stages of dying that can be applied to grief. So denial, we absolutely were in shock. Nope, you got the test wrong. It's not happening to me. You made a mistake. Test again. We can go through a stage of anger, where we are, mad at the world, mad at ourselves, mad at the doctor, might take it out on our loved ones. We can go through a stage of bargaining, often where we're bargaining with the world, with the universe, with higher powers. If you just give me another year, or if you heal me, I promise I'll be a better person. I'll make up for this, that, or another thing, right? We can go through a state of depression. where we feel a sense of hopelessness, and we can reach a point of acceptance where we're at peace with it. Now, some people go through all of these stages. These aren't sequential. This is the curve she presented, but guess what? It look like this. The curve does not look the same for everybody. The period with which you might stay in one stage is not consistent with everybody. The sequence is not consistent. You may skip stages. You may return to stages. And so know that this is not linear by any stretch of the imagination. But it is not uncommon that you experience all of these stages, sometimes very quickly. Sometimes you can stay in one stage for a long period of time. But when you're facing death, it's possible that it can still inspire growth. It can still inspire reflection. And in some cultures, they actually view death as a new birth, right? So it brings about new opportunities. It brings about new contributions. And so death is not always an end in some cultures and in some beliefs. And also knowing that you're dying, and if you look at Steve Jobs and a lot of quotes by Steve Jobs, oh my gosh, when he was diagnosed with his cancer, he used that as an opportunity and an inspiration. It made him approach life in a fundamentally different way. And so, a diagnosis can be an inspiration as well. I am just going to look ahead. I think I'm going to cut the video here and try to do a separate one, if that's okay, for feminist theories. So I'll come back. Aloha.